Good morning. All right, I know that was a pretty large chunk, and I want to kind of talk about that a little bit because, we have been kind of taking a little bit of a break from Acts here the last few weeks. Now we haven't been obviously taking a break per se, but we've had Easter in there, we've had Mission JC in there, all that, so we've stepped away from Acts a little bit, okay? So this is kind of us getting back into it. And I know this is kind of a hard way to get back into it, because what do? We start out by reading the entire chapter 7 of Acts. So like I said, I know that's a lot to digest, but as we were approaching this text, what it kind of made me think is like the pros and cons, so to speak, of expository preaching, which is what Dave and I have been doing basically since September. Now, in a very, very basic definition, expository preaching is basically like you pick a book of the Bible and you just kind of walk through it verse by verse together, okay? Like I said, that's a very, very simple definition, okay? But in essence, that's what we're doing. We kind of did with the Fall Fellowship study with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. We're doing it again here with Acts. We started, chapter 1. As we were reading, watch the video here from Bible Project, we started in chapter 1, came all the way here to chapter 7, okay? Like in essence, expository preaching. As the opposed would be what we consider topical type preaching, okay? And topical type preaching would basically be, I want to choose something to talk about, and I'm going to pick different verses in order to support that topic. So let's say I want to talk about sin. So I would go to Genesis and talk about how, sin first came to be and so on and so forth, right? And therefore you have a topical sermon. Nothing wrong with that. It's just not what we're doing. So here's the upside with expository preaching, what we're doing, okay? You're not allowed to skip anything. So if we start in Acts chapter 1 and we say that we are going to go through this verse by verse, when we come to something difficult, something that we really have to wrestle with, we have to wrestle with it. So this might be what I would consider maybe the second time we really had to wrestle with something difficult in Acts. First time being Acts chapter 5, which again we saw in the video where the 2 people were killed because of their sin. Okay, that was hard, that was difficult, right? So this time now we don't get to get this nice happy ending for Stephen. No, he speaks the truth to these people and they kill him. That's something difficult that we have to wrestle with, but because we're choosing to approach Acts in this way, we have to wrestle with it, okay? Now, with that being said, and the reason why we had to do all of Acts 7, like I said, I know that was kind of difficult to just sit there and just kind of, digest, but if we think about this, if we really wanted to take Stephen's speech, Stephen's sermon here, and break it up, we could have, but we're a church that doesn't like to take scripture out of context, right? So if we were to do that, we could, in essence, be taking stuff out of context because Stephen ultimately, in his speech, is trying to make one singular point. And we would not be doing it justice if we tried to break it up. Okay? So when we came across Acts 7, now we're looking at the downside, so to speak, of expository preaching because we can't take that out of context. We have to wrestle with the whole thing because we're talking about one singular point. Okay? So, with that being said, that's kind of the upside and the downside to how we're doing this, is we have to approach an entire chapter at a time. Now, next week, actually, David's going to come in and he's going to unpack chapter 7, but in a different way. So we're going to be right back here, okay? So I don't want to give away anything because he's got another take on this than what we're going to talk about today, okay? So in essence, what Stephen's doing here is giving these really broad history strokes of Jewish culture, okay? I mean, in a lot of ways, he's just doing these really broad strokes in order to make a point, okay? He drops some pretty big names, okay? He drops, Moses and Abraham and Joseph, okay? These really big names, okay? Now, whenever you are speaking to Jewish culture and you're dropping these names, you're going to have some ears perk up a little bit, okay? Because everyone can relate to Abraham, right? He's the father of their nation. Everyone knows Joseph. Everyone knows Moses. So whenever you're using those as example, you mean business. Okay? So that's what Stephen's doing. He's trying to get their attention. He's trying to show them that there's a trajectory of the Jewish culture that is not good. Okay? He's trying to point out that there's things happening here that are not good. And the ironic part of this whole thing is that Stephen's end proves his own point on what he's trying to prove to these people. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to unpack Stephen's speech a little bit. Now, I know, like I said, we're doing the entire chapter 7 of Acts, but we are not going to be here for 2 hours, I promise, okay? But we are going to try to unpack this a little bit because Stephen takes the time to point out these specific individuals when he's making his point. So obviously there's a reason why he's choosing these individuals. Okay, so the first one that we come to is Abraham, right? That's the first one he's kind of talking to. Now, whenever Stephen is talking about Abraham, he almost kind of paints this picture of this adventurous heart of Abraham, right? He goes out not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing where he's going or anything like that, but he goes out and he obeys God in this, right? And Stephen's trying to paint this picture of Abraham that no matter what, he trusts God in what he was going to be doing. Okay? He didn't necessarily have a strategy behind it or anything like that. He just trusted God and he walked out on that. Okay? So Stephen is trying to point out the adventurous heart of Abraham. Okay? But Stephen's also trying to make a contrast with this point. Every one of these people, he's saying, this is what God is intending this person to represent, but there's a contrast. Whichever one of these. So with Abraham, you have this, like I said, this adventurous heart that's wanting to obey God and everything and all that, right? But then you have Stephen saying, but in contrast, you're not. You're not doing that. You are allowing yourselves to be stable by worshiping like in a temple, by clinging to past, by clinging to tradition. In a lot of ways, the entire father of your nation, you're turning your back on. Everything that he taught us to do. Okay? So, in the 17th century, there was this military strategist called Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell, not only was he a military strategist, but he was also a politician. Very wealthy, everything like that. Okay? So he was able to, back in those, to be able to afford the private tutors. Right? So one thing it's written in that he liked to do was whenever he would hire a tutor, he would always try to instruct the tutor on how to teach, okay? Which is really kind of funny. But he would always tell the tutor, I would wish him to learn a little history. So he always told, no matter what, I want my son to learn history. This is a military strategist. This is a guy that his job was to sit and think and make sure and do step by step, right? He was meant to think things out. But he wasn't always looking to the future. He would look to the past. So why is that important? It's important because he saw failings, but he also saw victories. He was able to compare the two and know the correct way to go. Right? Because if he was going to strategize military advancements, he'd like to know the best way to do that. So he'd always look to the past. He'd always look to history on the best way to do things. And that's what Stephen is trying to do here. He's trying to say, guys, look to your past. Look to your past. Because there are things that you have done that are right, but there are a lot of things you've gotten wrong. And I am urging you not to repeat your mistakes. I'm urging you not to repeat your mistakes. So now we're going to move on. The next person that we talk about here is Joseph. So the first one, right, was Abraham. So he moves to the next person, Joseph. Now there's a lot of people in between there that he could have picked to point out, but for some reason, he picks out Joseph to talk about. All right? Now there's a certain characteristics of Joseph that make it important why we're choosing this person to talk about, why Stephen's doing that, okay? With Abraham, he was an obedient person, he was a faithful person, he was hopeful. Stephen points out that, Abraham never even saw the promise, right? But he was hopeful that God was going to fulfill that promise. So there was characteristics of Abraham that Stephen wanted to point out. And equally so, there are characteristics of Joseph that Stephen is wanting to point out. Joseph can basically be summed up in Genesis 50, verses 20 and 21. As the video was kind of talking about a little bit earlier, so Joseph was the one, he was persecuted by his family, by his brothers specifically, right? They sold him into slavery to Egypt. But what did Joseph do when he got there? Did he die? Did he wither away? Did never hear from him again? Anything like that? No. He started from basically being a slave in Egypt and worked himself up, but then had a little run-in with some royalty and a rape, almost, right? And got knocked all the way back down to prison, okay? And then what's he do from there? He works himself all the way back up again. because God was with him, right? Works himself all the way back up again to the point where now he eventually becomes like the prime minister of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, okay? Joseph was the one that prophesied that there was just going to be this famine, okay? That there was going to be no food, no water, anything like that. And he goes to Pharaoh and he warns him about this famine, saying, hey, you're about to lose all your food. You're going to need to start storing things up, start to make some provisions for that. Pharaoh, believing Joseph in this prophecy, puts Joseph actually in charge of all of that. Puts him in charge of the entire household, as Stephen points out. So puts him in charge of storing up all this food for everybody, everything like that. And just like Joseph prophesies, the famine comes. There's a food shortage, water shortage, everything like that. So people are coming to Egypt because they know that Egypt right now has food. They have food, so they're coming to Egypt asking for rations, okay? So that's what we, in Genesis chapter 50, that's what we see here is actually Joseph's family, that's kind of hard to say, Joseph's family coming to him asking for rations. But Joseph says, no, I want you to go back and bring everybody to Egypt before I give you any food. So they go back, they bring their entire family of it, and when they come back, Joseph finally reveals himself, shows who he is, and his brothers react by going, oh no, this is the guy we sold to slavery, this is the guy that we left for dead, and now our fate is in his hands. He's the one who controls all of the food and everything. We've really messed up. And how does Joseph respond? So Genesis 50, verses 20 and 21, this is how Joseph responds. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many, people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. What I actually love most about this is not the fact that, Joseph shows forgiveness. It's like, oh, it's okay, I'll feed you, everything like that. Because he does, right? They come and ask for food. He goes, don't worry, I'll give you food. I'll take care of you. Don't worry about that. But how does he react? He doesn't say, I'll just give you food. I'll help you out. I'll make sure you don't starve to death, but I don't want anything to do with you. Is that how he reacts? No, that's not how he reacts. He actually reacts the exact opposite. He goes, not only am I going to give you food, I'm going to give you provision, I'm actually going to give you land so you guys stick around, and I'm going to comfort you and speak kindly to you. So not only am I going to take care of you even after you sold me to slavery and left me for dead, but I'm going to take care of you and I'm going to pursue a relationship with you. This speaks a lot to Joseph's character. And this is why Stephen uses him as an example. Joseph shows a lot of grace and a lot of wisdom with how he handles this situation. So Stephen's trying to point out that this is the heart. God has placed these people to be guides for us, to show us the right way, to speak truth into our lives, right? Abraham was one example, showing that we need to be able to step out on faith, to be obedient to God no matter what. Joseph, he's our example that we need to be able to approach people around us, everything with grace, with love, with wisdom, everything like that, right? With forgiveness, right? There's that other example. But Stephen's also pointing out, in contrast, how did you guys treat Joseph? How did his family and his countrymen treat him? They persecuted him. They tried to kill him. They put him into slavery. And Stephen's pointing out, like, you guys are doing the same thing again. You're doing it again. God sent us somebody to speak truth into you, to show you the way, to provide righteousness, to grace, and you guys are doing nothing but persecuting, and you killed him. You guys are repeating mistakes. And Stephen's trying to use these examples to point this out. The last one Stephen uses is Moses, and he actually spends the most amount of time on Moses. Now, I'd say most of the time, just due to Sunday schools like that, when people think about Moses, they probably think about two major things, maybe three, but two major things. One, either the plagues or like 10 Commandments, one of the two, okay? Probably what they think about. The other one is parting of the Red Sea. Right? Those are probably the two big things people think about when they think of Moses. Now, whenever Stephen uses Moses as an example, I think it's important for us to get a more complete history of Moses. Okay? So now, Our Christian Bible honestly doesn't give us much as far as Moses' early life. It talks about his birth and everything like that, right? And then it just kind of skips over some years, so to speak, okay? So what I want to kind of talk about is there was a first century Jewish historian, and his name was Josephus, okay? And so he wrote a little bit more about the history of Moses. And Stephen kind of alludes to this a little bit, saying that Moses was like pretty, right? He was beautiful in God's eyes and everything. So Josephus kind of talks about that a little bit as well, saying that Moses was actually a very pretty man, okay? He was very good looking, okay, is what this historian says. It's like, okay, well, why is that important? It's important because Josephus tells a story of the princess bringing Moses, baby infant Moses, to Pharaoh, asking Pharaoh to make Moses his heir. Like, you should make this one your heir. And it actually says in the story that Pharaoh, as a joke, takes his crown and puts it on the infant. Has anyone ever tried to put a hat on a baby? It doesn't always work out, right? We actually have a little sun-blocking hat for Jacob, and he just won't keep it on. He even has the Velcro, like you try to tie it as tight as you can, so it doesn't come off. No, it just pulls it right off. Well, in the story, that's what Moses does. He takes the crown and just shoves it off and throws it to the ground. Well, there's, again, how the story goes is there is a wise man in the court that comes up to Pharaoh and says, this is a sign that he is going to destroy the kingdom of Egypt, and this baby should be put to death immediately. So the princess, like again, how the story goes, grabs Moses, hold him tight, convinces her father not to kill the baby. Obviously, we know at that point in history, Moses is not killed. And then it actually goes on and says that Moses became quite a military leader for Egypt, won several battles, everything, eventually conquering Ethiopia, which I know is kind of hard for us to think about that Ethiopia was a major player back then, but they were. Anyway, so conquered Ethiopia, actually married like an Ethiopian princess, that kind of thing. And anyways, and back in those days, if you were a military leader that won a lot, that was a lot of respect. That was a big deal, okay? So Moses had a lot going for him. At one point, he was, even though it was a joke, was made heir to the Egyptian kingdom, was a great military leader, married a princess, which in turn made him royalty, right? All of that. But what do we find out later? And even Stephen kind of alludes to this, right? Moses leaves. He seeks out his brothers and sisters, his fellow Jews, right? He seeks them out and tries to, get a relationship there and everything. But what do? They push him away. They push him aside. So Moses leaves. Then we have the story of the burning bush. We have all of that. He comes back, and eventually we have the Exodus. Moses leads them out, everything like that. So we have this story of a man who literally had a kingdom in his hands and turned it away. We have the story, we have this picture of a man that sacrificed greatly, sacrificed an entire kingdom in order to lead the Jewish people in the Exodus. And how do they react? Well, at first they push him aside, and then in the wilderness, they actually make their own God because they no longer want to follow Moses because they have no idea where he went, right? We're starting to see Stephen paint more and more of this messianic picture of this idea of sacrificing greatly in order to save a people. And then in contrast, Stephen's also pointing out how they're making the same mistake. God sent a leader, someone who was willing to sacrifice everything to save a people, and they turned their back on him on a moment's notice. There's a reoccurring theme that Stephen's trying to point out. That when God presents himself in truth, you persecute it. You turn away from it because you are too caught up in tradition and the past. You are too caught up in what you want to do in order to hear what God is trying to do. So obviously there's an overall theme here of persecuting leaders of the church. Persecuting people who are willing to step out and speak about God, speak truth, speak gospel. There's an obvious theme here that Stephen's trying to allude to. There's also something else we need to make sure we understand. I think we've said it before, you might have heard it before, right? The Bible might not have been written to us, but it's written for us, right? Has everyone heard that that phrase before? Okay, it's not written to us, but it's written for us. Okay, so if we were truly to believe that, that would mean that every part of this Bible, okay, every word in this Bible holds weight that we should be able to apply in 21st century Jefferson City, Missouri, right? Because it's written for us. There's application here. So again, now we've come across a story here in the Bible that somehow, it's uncomfortable. This man came up and he was basically proclaiming gospel truths and everything, and he was killed for it. But yet somehow we have to apply that to ourselves. And that's uncomfortable. Because, don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting anyone to go down on High Street, start proclaiming the gospel, and be stoned. I'm not expecting that. But there's still application here if we're going to believe this. Okay? So there's two ways that we're going to look at this real quick, okay, as a sum up. Okay, obviously we're going to focus on the theme of persecution, okay, because I think we can all agree that now that we are moving into a post-Christian age here in the United States, that there's starting to be this persecution of Christianity as a belief, right? We are no longer what I would say a Christian society. Right? We're just not. You hear on the news all the time, 10 Commandments being pulled out of state buildings and all this other stuff, right? Of Christian themes, Christian ideals, everything being excluded from public schools, from all this other stuff, right? And you could make that leap that yes, we are beginning to be persecuted in the United States. But if we are to take the same theme that Stephen's kind of talking about here, well, we need to look to our past. What can we learn from the book of Acts so far? From the book of Acts so far, what we have learned is every time the church has been persecuted, has been put down, it's expanded. It's expanded. So why would we believe anything else at this point? So instead of looking at the United States or anything starting to persecute Christians, if you want to think of it that way, instead of looking at that and grumbling about it and starting to get disheartened about it, why don't we look at this as being a hopeful thing that, wow, maybe God's brewing something? Because if history has taught us anything, persecution simply means expansion. And we're getting ready to move into Acts 8, where we're going to see that. We're going to see this more and more. As more pressure is put on the church, just kind of like Play-Doh. As you squeeze Play-Doh, the more it expands. Okay, and that's what we're going to see. Okay, now, if we're going to believe that, there's another side to this. There's a flip of the coin. Yes, we are persecuted, but we all have to agree that we also persecute. Because in every single one of these stories, we're Stephen, proclaiming truth, saying, you're right, these are things that we need to do better. This is what you need to do better, right? It's easy, you get up here and you preach, you say, you speak the word like I'm doing right now, and you proclaim it, and you're all this. But at the same time, throughout this week, I might have sinned, idolatried, anything like that. Not only have I persecuted, but I'm persecuted, not only have I been persecuted, but I persecute. There's a flip to the coin. And I think everyone can agree. Everyone here has run to something for a comfort that is not necessarily lining up with the word. Everyone here has done something to put something else above God. Everyone here has sinned. We all fall short. But there's grace, right? But we have to agree with both truths, that not only are we being persecuted, but we persecute. It's really easy to judge someone else's life whenever you see them doing something wrong, right? That's easy. It's easy to do. So we have to be willing to believe both sides. Now there's another figure, and again, the video kind of alludes to this, that is standing there during this stoning. Okay, of Stephen. Actually, one thing I want to point out really quick is it says it's a stoning. But like I said, like the video was saying, they brought like false witnesses and everything like that. So let's be very clear here. It's a lynching. Okay, it's a lynching being hidden by a trial, by a stoning. Okay, it's a lynching, all right? It's a false witness. They said they brought false witness and everything like that. Okay, they brought out and they intended to kill him from the beginning, one of those kind of deals, okay? But anyways, so we have Saul there, and he is, picking up the coats of these people, everything as they are stoning Stephen. And Saul, as we know, eventually becomes Paul, who is a majority writer, right, in the New Testament. He becomes the Apostle Paul. So this is a big deal. Saul is standing here witnessing the first Christian martyr, and this is not something he soon forgets. Even what we're going to see like here in Acts chapter 8, where Saul actually starts to ravage the church. This is when Saul starts to do all the bad things, right, everything like that. But it's still something with Stephen, there's no way he forgot that. It's something that stuck with him, okay? So what we're going to do now is start the process of closing. And actually turn to Philippians 3 real quick, if you would. So like we were talking about, so Paul actually wrote Philippians, okay? And there's just something I want to point out with the way Paul views things, okay? And this is going to, like I said, this is all going to tie back into Stephen a little bit. So this is going to be Philippians chapter 3. And just like the reason why we had to read all of chapter 7, I don't want to take anything out of context, okay? So what we're actually going to do is read verse 12 and read down that a little bit, okay? And then I'm going to bump back and give it a little bit of context, okay? And just so we can understand how a verse can look a little different depending on how you read it, okay? So first thing we're going to do, Philippians 3:12. Not that I have already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus had made me his own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Man, we're all going to just go out and run half marathons and achieve everything for Christ because he gives us power. And it's all about him, but look at all the things I can achieve and look at all the power I have because of Christ. I'm going to get this prize and I'm going to reach this goal, right? And that's how this is all kind of seeming. Now this kind of points to, I wasn't necessarily going to talk about this, but life kind of leads you in ways. This kind of reminds you of another thing he writes just a chapter later that a lot of times is taken out of context as well. And that's Philippians 4:13. If John 3:16 was voted the most popular verse in the New Testament, Philippians 4:13 would be voted the most likely to appear on a coffee mug. Okay? Philippians 4:13 is, do all things through Christ, which gives me strength. Right? Which is great. Right? It makes it sound really, it's like, I can do all things. I'm going to climb this mountain. I'm going to drive this race car because Christ gives me strength. But what are we really talking about here? So let's go back. I want to go back to verse 7 in chapter 3. And let's talk a little bit more about what Paul's actually saying. But whatever gain I had, I count it as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ. The righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and power of his resurrection and may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Now that's a little different. We're not talking about this prize, this goal that we all need to do, It's like, I'm going to get in shape, and I'm going to reach this goal because I can do all things through Christ. No, we're talking about sharing in the sufferings of Christ. We're talking about being there and enduring the persecution that we all know that we're going to have to endure. Being able to have that thumb pressed on us a little bit, being able to endure that and be content in all things, which by the way is what 4:13 really is, being able to be content in all things, even if I have all the riches of the world, the biggest house on the street, the most fanciest car, or I'm starving to death, chained to a wall in a prison, I can do all things. I can endure all things because I am meant first and foremost to share in the sufferings of Christ. That's the goal. That's the prize. Paul is saying, I have witnessed what it looks like to share in the sufferings of Christ. I've seen a man stoned to death while proclaiming the gospel. I've seen that suffering. And I'm going to tell you right now, guys, I have not reached that goal. I am far from perfect. This is Paul speaking, right? He goes, I haven't obtained that goal. I know what that goal looks like. I've seen it happen firsthand. You think you're suffering? That's not suffering. I've seen suffering. But how do we endure things? Yeah, it's like through Christ which strengthens. Okay, how? How does he strengthen us? What does that mean? Well, this goes back to what Stephen was talking, and this is, for real, going to be my closing. Stephen alludes to it right before they stone him. And he looks up, and what does he say? I see the Son of Man, and he's next to the throne, right? He's standing next to the throne. I don't want to speak too much about the Son of Man, because that's going to be next week more than likely, but I do want to talk about the aspect of him standing next to the throne, because that's our strength. Sarah and I have really gotten into this show called The Good Wife. Anyone watch The Good Wife? Don't let your kids watch that show, by the way. But anyways, The Good Wife, it's a lawyer show, right? Okay, that trials and courts and judges and all that, okay? Anyways, so if you watch that, okay, how they do that, whenever a attorney wants to defend their client, what do they do? If they're sitting at the table, what do? They stand up. Objection. And they stand up and they proclaim objection because they're defending their client. See, Christ died, yes, for our sins so that we can be forgiven. Yes, that's essential, but there's another part of that. He was also resurrected and set up and enthroned, standing next to the Father, right? And he is sitting there and he is defending us and our sin. Because like we said before, if we have to agree that we are persecuted, we also have to agree that we persecute. We all sin. We all fall short. We all have our issues. But we serve a just God. And Jesus is up there saying, Lord, look, I know he messed up again. I know he fell down again. I know he's not quite doing this right. I know that. But you are also a just God, and your wrath has already been satisfied through me. And it'd be unjust for you for also to send your wrath down upon them. He is standing and he is our defender. He is our advocate. And that is where our strength comes from. Not because it's our strength, not because we are good enough, not because of our righteousness, but because he is righteous. And God looks upon him and that's all he sees. He doesn't see us. He sees Jesus because Jesus is enthroned. And that's how Stephen was able to say, forgive them, as he was being stoned. And I love that at the end, it doesn't say he died. It said he fell asleep. That's our strength. That's how we handle being persecuted. That's how we find the strength to step out in obedience like Abraham did. That's how we find that ability to have grace and wisdom for those who falsely imprison us or try to kill us or anything like that. That's how we find that strength. That's how we find the strength of, like Moses did, to give up everything that doesn't matter in order to step out in faith and lead. We find that because Jesus is enthroned. And he's made all things new. Not because I get up here and I talk a lot. Not because we're Memorial Baptists, not because this is the United States and we're privileged. No, Jesus is enthroned. That's where our strength comes from. And that's how we can handle our persecution. Ask Scott and them to come back up. There is obviously still a part of this where you can endure sufferings, and yes, you can do things through Christ that strengthens you, absolutely. But first and foremost, we need to understand that it is only through faith and it is through Jesus that we have received these things. So if you find that you are in a place today where you're not really sure where you stand with Jesus, where you stand in your faith, where you stand in your salvation, to where it's like, yeah, there's supposed to be a strength there, but I don't feel it. I don't have it. I have trouble standing on that truth. If you find that you're there this morning, I want to pray with you. I want to speak with you. And not just me, we'll have a couple other guys probably that can come down and help as well. But I want you to fully grasp the idea that without Jesus, without that strength, there are things in this life that we're just not going to be able to endure. But there is who was it? C.S. Lewis said that if you do not look to that which is above you, how do you think that anything's going to be able to help you? So if we constantly look to, I'm going to find my strength within, well, that's an equal playing field. How am I going to raise myself up? Can't do that. That doesn't make sense. Yes, you can make the argument that there are people around you that can encourage you, everything like that. But even that, we're talking what a half step is best. It is only an enthroned Jesus Christ that can raise you up above anything that you can endure. When life's good, he's there. When life's bad, he's there. So if you find yourself struggling, maybe you don't even want to talk to me about it. I'm okay with that. You're not going to offend me. We say before, there's steps up here, and they're just steps. There's nothing magical about them or anything like that. But if you feel the need, you're welcome to come up here and pray. You're welcome to pray at your seat. But I want you to contemplate that there should be a strength available to all of us. How much are you tapping into it? This is your time to respond.